Lambrecht says, two recent stories from the United Methodist News Service deserve a response. The first was a news article about the announced intention of Good News and the Wesleyan Covenant Association to participate in the upcoming General Conference in Charlotte, North Carolina in April. So that News article is this one where it has a picture of Tom right there. And I think that's John Lomperis and Beth Ann Cook. That would be from a while back. So this is an article that, well, he'll tell you what it said. The second article was a commentary by Reverend Levitt H. Weems, Jr., further criticizing Good News and the Wesleyan Covenant Association for our involvement. The argument voiced in both articles is that only those who have a long-term commitment to the UMC should participate in deciding the future of that church. In the words of the Reverend Drew Dyson, a delegate from Greater New Jersey, quote, "Our polity should be determined by those whose intention is to remain faithfully within the UMC. In my estimation, Good News and the WCA are simply attempting to undermine and harm the work of the UMC under the guise of fairness for their allies," end quote. There were a handful of other critical responses in the news article, and fair enough. It should be noted that both Good News President Rob Renfro and I remain ordained clergy in good standing in the United Methodist Church. That might be something not a lot of people know, but yeah, Lambrecht and Renfro have both put their money where their mouth is and stayed invested in the institution that they're trying to influence. That's an integrity move. Lambrecht says, since 1972, Good News has participated in every general conference by expressing our views on topics up for consideration at the conference. We have helped to organize like-minded delegates to support traditionalist positions on issues. Other caucus groups, such as MFSA, RMN, and other more liberal groups have engaged in similar activity at these same general conferences. In the past, the Love Your Neighbor Coalition has even recruited non-United Methodists to come and participate in protests that have disrupted the functioning of General Conference. I don't know about MFSA, but I know that Reconciling Ministries Network is only partially United Methodist. It's like the IRD. It has people in leadership that are not even United Methodist, but are trying to influence the United Methodist Church. So this is an apples-to-apples comparison here. Lambrecht says, our participation in the 2024 General Conference, however, will be different. Rather than lobbying the delegates on a host of issues of concern, Good News and the WCA are in Charlotte to focus on only two issues. First is the need to provide equitable, feasible disaffiliation routes for annual conferences and local churches outside of the U.S. who have been denied the possibility that we in the U.S. had to discern our future. So this is something that I've talked plenty about. Tom Bickerton, whenever he was the president of the Council of Bishops, just said paragraph 2553 does not apply to churches outside of the U.S., period. That was the end of it. And that's inequitable. That's why Edward Armel and many in the WCA have the Fair for Some, Fair for All campaign. If UMs in the U.S. could get out, UMs outside of the U.S. should be able to get out if they want to. And Lambrecht will talk more about that in a minute. Second is to support our African friends in their opposition to the proposed regionalization of the church. So that's new to me. I was under the understanding that Good News was willing to advance the cause of regionalization if caucus groups on the other side would allow for an easy exit for Africans or, non-Americans. It would seem that has fallen apart, and now Lambrecht and Good News are advocating for stopping regionalization and for allowing for disaffiliation from the UMC for non-Americans. Lambrecht says, we will not be in Charlotte to, quote, undermine and harm the work of the UMC, end quote, in any way, unless one considers enacting fairness and justice harming the work of the church. Now, that might seem kind of snarky, but that's a serious point. There are a lot of people who are so tribal at this point that if you're advancing just a universally good policy for transparency and integrity, depending on who submits it, they're going to stand against it. It's the same kind of like orange man bad phenomenon where even if President Trump had a good policy, people were against it because he could do nothing good. this kind of tribal mindset that people get into where they can't like exercise their critical thinking or stand on principle. They just have their good guys and their bad guys, they're white and they're black, and they advance their that's what he's pointing out here is our agenda is good for the church, but if you receive it as bad, that's indicative that you're not thinking morally or critically, you're only thinking tribally. That's my language that I'm putting on him. I don't think he uses that language. We will not be lobbying, he says, on the budget or attempting to block changes to the denomination's definition of marriage and ordination standards. That was news to me because they are trying to change it. If you've watched my Considering Charlotte series, in the revised social principles are trying to get adopted, it clearly redefines marriage as between two people, not between a man and woman. So he's saying that Good News is giving up on that fight. They're just letting it go how it goes. And okay. He says, we will not be critiquing the proposed new social principles or weighing in on the number of bishops the church should have. The future of the UMC is for those who will be living with that future to determine. The question is, however, who will be part of the Church? Will the church be a coalition of the willing or a fellowship of the coerced? And that's the key issue for me and so many is, okay, we got out. What they seem to want is this kind of sociopathic tendency to just kind of, and I've critiqued a lot of people who've done this in the Global Methodist Church who've gone independent. They're just, well, too bad they couldn't get out. We have concerns. We have green fields over here we're going to pay attention to. We don't care about them anymore. I just think that's a morally heinous place to be in. Just because you were privileged enough to get out doesn't mean that you can turn your back on those who weren't, So I think we all have to be invested from the inside and outside of the institution to facilitate an amicable split as much as possible. Otherwise, you're looking at still millions of people being withheld and kept in a fellowship that they don't want to be in. Now, that's all I need to say about that for now. So let's go a little bit further with the article. Is disaffiliation over? Lambrecht says the heart of the institutional narrative is that, in Weems' words, quote, the period of disaffiliation is over. It is a time for all groups to move on from dividing to unifying and disciple-making, end quote. Who gets to say that the period of disaffiliation is over? Institutional leadership in the U.S.? People who have already had the chance to discern the future of the Church? How can disaffiliation be over when more than half of the UMC has not had an opportunity to even consider disaffiliation, much less act on it? It's talking about non-Americans. If the shoe were on the other foot, would the charge of colonialism be leveled? U.S. leaders should not be the lone arbiters for determining that the privileges and opportunities available in the U.S. will not be allowed in the central conferences outside of the U.S. I haven't heard a serious argument against this point. I've heard some people outside of the U.S. say, no disaffiliation, we're staying together. That doesn't really address American voices withholding non-Americans from disaffiliation and like the overt kind of racist undertones that has. We'll let the rich, white, privileged people in America go who want to go, but you poor brown and black people, no, you don't have the muscle. We're keeping you. We're keeping your assets. There are some other questions of fairness. Oh, look at all these questions. Lambrecht says, how can disaffiliation be over when several annual conferences convince some of their churches to wait and to see what the 2024 General Conference does before considering disaffiliating? This happened a ton, by the way, if you've been paying attention. This is one of the things, right off the top of my head, I can remember Graves said that. Holston said that. There are a lot of bishops that along the way said, hey, we don't know what's going to happen at General Conference, and for that reason withheld disaffiliations. Next one, how can disaffiliation be over when a dozen U.S. conferences impose such draconian costs on the process that it has been nearly impossible for churches in those conferences to afford to disaffiliate? So yeah, that's these cases in Pennsylvania or CalPAC, where they charged 50% of the real estate value of the church, or Baltimore, Washington. These are not the only conferences. These are just the ones that I can think of. He said there were about a dozen that were like this. Yeah, we're supposed to just forget about that and not care about them. How can disaffiliation be over when one annual conference said in late 2023 that churches had no grounds under the discipline or paragraph 2553 to disaffiliate and denied all further requests? What conference would that have been? Then, I mean, that was North Georgia. Is he talking about North Georgia? That got busted back open by the state judiciary. So I'm wondering which conference he's talking about. I guess I haven't been paying good enough attention. And then how can disaffiliation be over when there are at least 4 lawsuits underway in annual conferences that have made it nearly impossible for churches to disaffiliate? All right, and I talked about some of that. Weems writes, quote, "The upcoming general conference is for those who remain after the chaos of recent years. They have chosen to remain not because they all agree, but because they are willing to live together despite differences." End quote. Unfortunately for Weems, nearly half the delegates there have not chosen to remain. They have not been given the choice. In denying them the choice, the UM Church has handicapped itself and compromised its ability to move forward in a new direction. This is something that I've talked about several times on Plain Spoken. It is not a coalition of the willing whenever you're restraining people from leaving. And if they want to seriously consider themselves a coalition of the willing, then they have to get rid of, they have to allow for people to leave if they want to leave. This is something Simon Mafunda has been talking about on Considering Charlotte. And they have to do what they can to remedy stuff, even in the United States, where people have been withheld. It really would be wonderful to see what they can do if all they've got on board is people who are willing. That would be a worthy experiment. But right now the experiment has been, how can we withhold as many people as possible, take their assets from them, and liquidate them in order to feed ourselves? And that's an ugly project. It's embarrassing that so many people are okay with it. I'm not going to read the rest of the article because I want to move on. But the exhortation I would have for anyone who's watching this now or watching it later is not just to pray for the United Methodist Church, but to keep your eyes on them and to exercise what influence you have right now on the consciences of those delegates who are going to be attending. I think if they're listening to people like Mark Holland, not UM Action, but mainstream UMC, you get the impression that disaffiliation is over. Or you listen to Weems, you get the impression it's over, it's done. No, there's still a final die to cast, and it's still very much up for debate what happens. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, start watching the Considering Charlotte series I'm putting out. It really is interesting, and got great people on board there. But if you've been one of these that is kind of tempted to turn your head and look another direction, you really shouldn't, not for at least another month and a half. Let's all be in prayer for the general conference next month and do what we can to make sure that they make decisions that are for the benefit of everybody. Fair for some, fair for all, right?